What's going on, everybody? Kalipa's Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, I'm going to be giving you some reasons why you might not want to buy the Cricket Innovate E5G. Now keep in mind, these are not all going to be a big deal for everyone, and in general, I do think this is actually a pretty good phone for what it is. But that being said, of course, every phone has its drawbacks, so I'm going to be going over some of my least favorite things about this phone to give you a better idea of what you can expect if you get it. Now as always, before we go any further, I do want to remind you to hit that subscribe button, and if you want to learn more about this phone, I will be linking to several other videos about it in the description, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But with that being said, let's get into it. So my first reason why you might not want the Cricket Innovate E5G is because it doesn't have wireless charging. Now the reason I really bring this up is not because I expect it in a phone like this, but because another really similar phone, the Cricket Dream 5G, does actually have wireless charging. And since again, these phones are actually really similar, it could be easy to get the two confused. So definitely keep in mind, if you do want wireless charging, then the Cricket Dream 5G is the phone you're going to want, because again, this phone, the Cricket Innovate E5G, does not have wireless charging. And in general, it's really too bad because wireless charging is not a feature you typically find in non-flagship phones, so putting wireless charging in the Cricket Dream 5G was definitely a cool move by Cricket, and it really gave that phone more of a reason to stand out. But on the other hand, with the Cricket Innovate E5G, although this phone does still have its value obviously, seeing that this phone is so similar to the Cricket Dream 5G in almost every other way, not getting wireless charging with it is definitely a little disappointing. The second reason why you might not want the Cricket Innovate E5G is the battery. Now with this phone, we're getting a 4000 mAh battery that supports 10-watt fast charging, and granted, this is really not a terrible battery. But that being said, in this price range, even though this is a really entry-level phone, it's honestly not hard to find a phone that has a 5000 mAh battery. And while yeah, sure, a 4000 mAh battery really isn't small, there is a huge difference in battery life between this and something that has a much larger battery. So on one hand, if you're not really too concerned about battery life, maybe you want a decent battery, but you're pretty much around a charger most of the time anyway, then the battery on this phone is going to be perfectly fine for you. But on the other hand, if you have more of a mobile lifestyle and you're not always around a charger and battery life is really more of a priority for you, then you're probably going to want to go for a different phone that has a better battery. And another thing I did want to point out here is that with the 10-watt fast charging, while on one hand this is pretty much the worst fast charging you can get, in my experience, this phone's charging speeds have been pretty decent, so I really have no complaints there. Now my third reason why you might not want the Cricket Innovate E5G is the display quality. Now with this phone, we're getting a 6.6-inch LCD display with a resolution of 720p, a PPI of 269, and an aspect ratio of 20:9. So on one hand, at 6.6 inches, the display is decently large, which is good if you're consuming a lot of content, especially stuff like reading, and with the 20:9 aspect ratio, it does have a decently tall and narrow form factor, so if you're doing something like watching videos in landscape mode, for example, you're going to get a more immersive experience, and if you're doing something like reading, scrolling through social media, something like that, you'll be able to fit more content on the screen without having to scroll as much. So in that regard, this display is pretty good, but with a 720p resolution, the image is definitely not as sharp and crisp as something like, say, a Samsung Galaxy A13 LTE that's pretty much in the same price range, but has a 1080p display instead. In addition to this, with a really basic LCD display, while the colors and brightness are at least decent, the viewing angles are really not the best. As you can see here, it's not great already, but if you go outside in the sun, for example, or in a really bright room, in certain lighting, it's pretty much impossible to see. So if you are outside a lot, or just in really bright areas where you need to see your phone, then definitely keep this in mind, because in that case, you're probably going to want to go for a phone with a better quality display. But again, in general, keep in mind that in this price range, unless you have something like a TCL or a Samsung that usually has a good display no matter what, when it comes to image quality, an entry-level phone like this is just not going to be the best. So if you do want a really nice looking image, then definitely go for a higher end device. But in general, again, this phone does have really good size and dimensions. So if you're consuming a lot of content indoors, maybe you're mainly doing something like reading, for example, where the quality isn't super important, in that case, this display will still be at least decent. My fourth reason why you might not want the Cricket Innovate E5G is the mediocre storage. Now keep in mind, when it comes to storage, it can be kind of subjective, and depending on what you're doing with your phone, the storage on this phone might actually be good for you. With the Cricket Innovate E5G, we are getting 64GB of internal storage with microSD card expansion, so in general, in my opinion, this is really just not enough. On one hand, sure, it's at least acceptable, but in this day and age, with stuff like apps, the system, and just files in general getting larger and larger, I feel like in 2022, going into 2023, 128 is really going to be a bare minimum, especially if you have a lot of apps. Now that being said, at least we are getting microSD card expansion here, and 64GB is definitely still better than 32, which surprisingly some really low-end phones actually have. So if you're maybe more of a light user, and you're not really doing a ton on your phone, as long as you're mindful of what you're putting on it, then 64 should be at least acceptable. But again, if you're more of a power user, if you have a bunch of apps and you're really just doing a lot on your phone, then you're probably going to want to go for a slightly higher end device that has more storage. My fifth reason why you might not want the Cricut Innovate E5G is the materials. Now on one hand, it's really just a basic cheap plastic. Pretty much every lower end phone has a variant of this, but honestly I will say I like these materials even less because not only does it have no weight to it and just feel really cheap in general, but the plastic, especially on the back, really just isn't that durable. If you can see here, the back actually has a scratch on it and I haven't really done anything with this phone. So in general, it really does scratch pretty easily and it's definitely not very durable. Now I will give credit where credit is due. The build quality itself is decent, the buttons feel pretty sturdy, and the phone doesn't exactly feel like it's gonna fall apart. But just keep in mind, if you do get this phone, not only are the materials not very premium feeling at all, which granted you probably don't expect from a phone like this anyway, but again it does scratch pretty easily. So with this phone I definitely recommend getting some sort of case because that's gonna improve its durability quite a bit. My sixth reason why you might not want the Cricut Innovate E5G is because the screen really isn't very responsive. Now on one hand it's definitely usable. I mean, if you're doing just regular activities like browsing the web, using social media, stuff like that, it will work just fine. But as you can see, it's really not the most responsive. So if you're doing something like playing a game, for example, that's a lot more interactive than something like web browsing, then this is definitely not going to be the best choice for you. So in general, while on one hand, this is of course a really entry-level phone, and a lot of these phones are really just like that, overall I just noticed the screen is just a little bit worse than the average phone. And finally, my seventh reason why you might not want the Cricut Innovate E5G is the camera. Now on one hand, to be fair, as you can see in the full camera review I made of this phone, the image quality itself really isn't that bad, especially considering this is such a low-end phone. But on the other hand, when it comes to features, by 2022 standards, it has pretty much nothing. Up front here, we got a typical water drop notch selfie camera. This camera is 5 megapixels. Then on the back, we have only a dual camera setup with a 13 megapixel main camera and a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera. So in general, as you can see, when it comes to actual features, there's pretty much nothing here. No ultra wide camera, no macro camera, which is definitely a drawback because if you're taking a lot of photos, those features can be really useful. But that being said, again, to be fair, the photo quality itself is actually pretty decent. So if you're just taking a couple regular photos for social media, for example, then this phone will at least be acceptable. But those were my reasons why you might not want to buy the Cricut Innovate E5G. Again, keep in mind, this is really not a bad phone, and a lot of the drawbacks here, while being kind of annoying, are really just things you're going to find in pretty much any phone in this price range. So in general, if you're looking for a really affordable 5G phone that has great performance, a decent display, an okay amount of storage, and good camera quality for regular photos, then this phone is still going to be a decent choice. Now once again, if you want to learn more about this phone, I will be linking to several other videos about it in the description, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Cleepus Tech on Twitter and Instagram. And as always, I will see you in the next video.